Now enter what's called the Neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis, where the problem that Darwin had is he didn't know about genetics. Now that we know about genetics, this now becomes the way that we can enter variability into a population and enter all this information that must be required if an amoeba is going to become a man, right? So now we know all about this. There are various ways of mutating DNA. Okay, deletions, duplications, inversions, point mutations, changes, insertions, all kinds of things, transposable elements, and copying errors, right? Those copying errors happen regularly. There's a frequency, and that happens when DNA is replicated. Those mutations are sometimes carcinogenic or mutagenic. In other words, they can happen because of exposure to radiation. They can happen because of exposure to chemicals, smoke. They can happen because of viral insertions, all kinds of ways to mess around with DNA. The mutations, generally in terms of point mutations and others, are considered to be relatively rare, but they all have frequencies that can be measured. They do have damaging effects. They don't make things better. There's no real situation where these random kinds of mutations make the organism a better adapted organism. So on the right is the fruit fly. We've done hundreds and thousands of generations of mutations on fruit flies, and you know what? They're still all fruit flies. They're knobby wings and nubby wings, and different color eyes and strange kinds of fruit flies. But in all the generations of selective pressure on fruit flies, we still have fruit flies. They've never evolved in anything else. They've never gained any information that would lead them to another organ system, that would lead them in a direction. We can do the same thing with bacteria. Millions and millions and millions of generations of bacteria, 20-minute generation time, and we still have bacteria. We can do various manipulations in bacteria that will and then select for them artificially. We can go back into the artificial realm in the laboratory. But in the natural setting, there just doesn't seem to be any way to cross species boundaries. Now, many mutations have neutral effects. Now, this is really very important. The typical geneticists will say most mutations do not have a deleterious effect. They're more neutral. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, there was I believe he's Japanese geneticist who looked at this very, very closely. And he says, look, the distribution of negative versus positive mutations will look like this. And the line in the center that has 0 is no effect. And so his red line says that there are, on the left, a small number of really negative, toxic kinds of mutations that will kill an organism. And those are immediately selected out of the population because the organism dies. Never has time to breed, never has time to pass on those genes. Then there are some additional mutations up here that are not quite so deadly. Few of them get passed on. But then there's an inflection point where you have a large frequency of mutations that are not lethal, but they're not quite neutral either. They're still on the left-hand side of the curve. And the positive side is empty. It's not because I'm building a slide. His data, from his perspective, was he couldn't find a beneficial, positive affecting mutation. But he did want to understand this inflection point on the curve a little better. And so he said, okay, you know what that is? On both sides of the curve, that's a no selection zone. That is a place where those changes in the genetics don't change reproduction and differential survival and reproduction. So they accumulate. They're little changes in DNA that are called genetic load that accumulate because those get passed on because all of these organisms in here breed. And what they do is they pass on that genetic load to the next generation. It's not so toxic that it gets removed, and there's really no real effect on survival or replication to the extent that it would be selected for or against, so they're just carried along. And the problem with this genetic load is that it accumulates over time. It's like walking along a street and picking up a rock every hour and putting it in your pocket. 10 hours later, you got 10 rocks in your pocket. 100 hours later, you got 100 more rocks in your pocket. And it gets a little heavy. It gets hard to walk with that kind of accumulated baggage. And that's what genetic load is. Now, John Sanford has looked at this, and that genetic load translates into what's called a declining fitness, right? So we talk about Darwin saying that an animal has to be fit to survive. It has to, of course, what's fitness? Survival. If an animal is fit, it will survive. If it survives, it must be fit. It's what's called a tautology. But in any case, the idea is that this fitness or degree of adaptation to its environment is enough that it can leave offspring. But what happens with this genetic load is that the fitness goes down over generations. And so from a perfect fitness of 1, you could extrapolate with a particular declining fitness rate only 300 generations. And Dave may want to look at this and say, and Dr. Sanford may want to look at this and say, if we started out here as people and we get a 1% declining fitness per generation in human beings, that means we're only going to last 300 generations before our fitness is down to 0. And we'll just implode genetically. Now, if our fitness is a little different than that 1%, we might last longer than 300 generations. But genetic load and deterioration, along with the second law of thermodynamics, seems to be the law of the universe, at least in genetically replicating organisms. So mutations are not a good thing. But what do mutations really do? Well, they don't create new information, and they don't create new organs or new structures, and they don't increase fitness. Now, there's a lot of information behind this that we're not able to talk about, but this is kind of a visual concept that if evolution were true, there has to be not only an increasing degree of order over time, but an increasing influx of information and systems design type instructions into an organism, going from single-celled to multicellular to organ systems and vertebrates and complex behavior. Mutation is not where that comes from. And so mutation compromises fitness, and it sort of reflects the basic trend in nature of the inexorable decay of the second law of thermodynamics. That life is pushing itself up against the second law of thermodynamics for a little bit of time, and at death, all that goes back the other way. But during life, it's also accumulating genetic baggage that it passes on to the next group, the next generation. So, I want to go back to that slide by Roger Lewin. Does microevolution extrapolate to macroevolution in the modern synthesis? Because remember, now we've taken Darwinian evolution and we add to it a modern understanding of genetics. And this was done in 1980, 1990, 2000, 30 years ago. It's not a long time ago. Certainly after we well understood genetics and DNA, which happened in the 50s and 60s. So the extrapolation of microevolution to macroevolution was no 30 years ago, and you know what? It's still no today. So what does this all mean? There's abundant evidence for the reality of those 4 concepts that Darwin came up with. And microevolution does occur if you define it as change in allele frequencies. It's observed all the time. It happens. It's a normal, productive part of life. It allows for organisms to be able to adapt to their environments. But the evidence for a tree of life, a branching tree, is lacking. There is an embarrassing lack of transitional forms. There's no beneficial mutations that are observed. Now, there may be beneficial environments that select for particular mutations, but mutations themselves are not necessarily good or bad. Well, they certainly can be bad in terms of their baggage. And you think about sickle cell anemia kind of changes. That's not necessarily a good change. Those people are not healthy, because their red blood cells are sickled, but in a particular environment, that can be a beneficial change. So it's the environment that determines the benefit. And then genetic load does not improve fitness. So these genetic problems with a mechanism for evolution make it so that there's really not very much evidence for a tree of life. And we can't extrapolate these micro changes into the macro setting. There's not an apparent mechanism to increase useful genetic information to the degree that animals can cross species and whole kind of lineage boundaries. It really is a belief system, a worldview. Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the most famous evolutionists ever, says nothing in biology makes sense in the light of evolution, because he has that worldview where everything is evolution. And so biology can't make any sense except in the light of evolution. Well, the problem is that we can do biology, we can do experimental science, we can do genetics quite easily without any reference to evolution. In fact, evolution is seen by many as very superfluous. While the great majority of biologists would probably agree with Dobzhansky's dictum that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, most can conduct their work quite happily without particular reference to evolutionary ideas. I did when I was in the lab. Evolution would appear to be the indispensable unifying idea, and at the same time, a highly superfluous one. We don't need it to do 99.99% of all science, of all basic science. Now, if you're in evolutionary biology, you ought to have something to study, and so there must be something to write grants about. It's kind of the same thing with what do we call astrobiology, studying life among the stars. We haven't found any yet, so what exactly are you studying? I don't know, but it's good to write grants on. Mark Kirshner says, in fact, over the last 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution. Now, this is biology now, independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself. Molecular biology, biochemistry, and physiology have not taken evolution into account at all. And you can be quite happy and have 40, 50-year career in science without treading on the evolutionary grounds. You all know Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, anti-Christian, anti-religious person, a scientist who did his PhD on pecking behavior in chickens, and now is a world's authority on evolution. He has trouble with some of these arguments because we really can't see evolution happening. But he says, you know what? Evolution has been observed. It's just that it has not been observed while it was happening. He missed it. Poor Richard Dawkins. Thanks for your attention.